Twitter. So Monday, guys, you'll see this on YouTube, but we are live on Facebook, live on LinkedIn, live on Twitter. We don't go live on YouTube because the algorithms do not respect the long tail of the live content. They think it's just breaking news when it's not. So no, this is gonna be somewhat evergreen. Well, at least for the next 3 years. So we're gonna get into why. Joel White, I'm a huge fan now for like 2 weeks. Founder at Market Cap Consulting. I think the industry needs Joel. I think from some of the posts he's been writing on LinkedIn, he cuts through the BS. Like, there's all these DCT apologists, tech vendor apologists. There's apologists for anything in this space, but there's never like critical voices or the voices that kind of look logically at this stuff, especially from like the financial aspect.
Yep.
And Joel White, amazing post. You caught me, and then I brought you that post attention to Chris about IKEA purchasing Site Network for 300 million. Did they ever say how many sites were in it?
I counted about 30. 10
That's
million
what
a location. Not bad, Dan. Not bad.
Like just guessing. I'm like, that's got to be about 30 sites and 2 million each. EBITDA, 10x multiple.
Yeah, no, nothing disclosed on the profitability of cognitive CCT.
Man, if they were averaging 1 million EBITDA, that's a wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's all I would have to say.
So before we went live, you didn't disclose that, Dan. I didn't realize Joel was the one that wrote that article.
I told you, man. As soon as you came in, I said Joel
Did
wrote
you?
the article. Yeah, man.
Right. So I got a question.
Man, it ain't my fault if you don't listen, Chris. You gotta be a good co-host, man.
So not to derail the conversation right off the top.
Hold on, we didn't even introduce Joel. But okay, go ahead. No, you say your thing, and then we're gonna introduce.
Well, you and I did a video on this already, so since he wrote the article, I was gonna ask for clarification.
Well, who knows if he even watched the video?
On the hour-long discussion we had on something about that article.
Joel's so sophisticated, he probably watched our analysis and laughed.
So
I watched your business, the business of a CRO, that I think launched, and we can go into that if you want to. I think we've got some serious fact checking to do. No offense to your guest, but yeah, there were some whoppers there. Chris, go ahead, please.
So you used,
I can't remember.
You used 2 terms in that article that are somewhat interchangeable in the business.
Yeah.
So Dan and I had a long conversation about this, really an hour long, I think. So you use the term site network, and SMO.
Yep.
So do you know the difference between those 2 organizations?
Yeah, I think people are better to hear it from you because I get confused by it sometimes.
Okay, so I just found it very astonishing that IKEA paid 320 million.
300
for as much as 300 million, probably slightly less. The CEO's quote,
Probably the guy on both boards who was on both boards got the 20 finder's fee.
There you go.
Yeah, the rounding. Yep.
So I just found it very astonishing that IKEA would pay 300 million for a site network, right? Which really entails very little, if any, ownership in the actual businesses, right? Because those are all independently owned. It'd be difficult to purchase each and every one of those sites individually, I would assume.
Oh, yeah.
A site management organizations, oftentimes they do own at least a percentage of the sites. So that makes more sense. I just was curious if that were the case. Was it a site network that they paid 300 million for?
I don't know enough about cognitive to go into that. I have to go strictly off of what Ari, the CEO said. Which is that we paid close to $300 million for cognitive. That they paid 30 million for a different SMO, using the specific term SMO, and then it appears that they spent a total on acquisitions of, I think it was over 460 million in the quarter. So that delta 100 million is apparently benchmark clinical research, and because the owner of Benchmark reached out to me directly to clarify that he was not the 30 million.
It's Mark Lacey, right?
Yeah, that he was not the 30 million SMO. I think he was insulted by that. So
he should be insulted by
he
that.
should be.
Mark Lacey is an OG. He's been running. I've met him a few times. He's been running his site since like early 2000s. There's no way it's 30 million. Joel, with the way this bubble is growing, 30 million is almost like a startup.
Well, let's talk about that, Dan, because right before we went live, Chris asked a comment like, what are some of the underlying trends or themes that like I try to reinforce? And one of those is that sites are not poor.
Yes, let's do that. But before, like, let's do a proper intro, okay?
Intro.
Joel White, everybody, his LinkedIn's gonna be underneath this video, and if you're listening on the podcast, in the show notes, check it out. He's a must follow on LinkedIn, okay? He's the founder of Market Cap Consulting, where we're going to get into what he does, but basically helps companies improve their financial performance and strategy execution by providing unique, objective insight into the challenges and opportunities they face. He's been a vice president of finance at Synteract. Before that, he was a director of budgets and proposals at Chiltern. Chris, you might have worked with Joel. Like when somebody didn't do what you needed on the contract, you probably like ran it up the ladder to Joel. Par Excel, he was director of contracts management in Par Excel. PRA International, director of proposals and finance. So this is his background, just to give you guys an idea. And Chris, this is who Joel is, man. He's like the head honcho. When you're at a stalemate, they run it up to Joel. Like, hey, Joel, what do we do here? This guy Chris is insane. Like, what do you want us to do? Right?
Fun fact, Dan, 3 of those 4 CROs no longer exist.
They got merged, right? Like they got acquired.
That's the life of CROs. Yeah. Acquired, and soon you just don't see them anymore. Yeah.
Brad says Joel's too smart to be talking to you bozos. I agree. 100%, man. It's like we don't deserve people like Joel. I'm here thinking, how can I make a meme after this? Joel's out here like analyzing the markets.
Thanks, Brad.
Absolutely right, Brad. So you have like that intro was necessary because that's the context of where you're coming from. You're not some dude from Wall Street giving your opinion. You've been heavily on the CRO side. I guess if you had to sum up your CRO career, and the insights you've gained from working on that side of contracts and budgets and all that, what is it that the public doesn't know?
That pricing, the way you price your services and products, is critically important to the financial success of an organization. And I over 80% of what I do is focused on pricing. The rest of it is on how to financially manage, your projects, trials, etc., successfully. But I really found pricing was the passion. Part of it is because my background's in economics, and so I'm just fascinated at how organizations determine and exchange value and money and things like that. So even before I entered the industry, I worked at Victoria's Secret. That was where my career was before I joined the industry, by the way. Before I joined the industry, I just always had a fascination with how companies price things, and then how they deliver. But when I came into the industry, that introduced me to the world of services, and so that's why I focus so much on pricing, and there you go. So yeah, founder of Market Cap Consulting. That's just me. Market Cap Consulting is me. I am Market Cap Consulting, and I work exclusively on the service and technology provider side of the industry, and because that's my people.
So Dan, just a thought tangent to that, what Joel just laid out there. We could have used his services about 2 days ago, it sounds like.
Oh yeah, we could use his services any day, man. This is one of the reasons why I love this job of doing what I do is like meeting people like you, and that I have no business meetings. Like Brad said, I mean, Brad's not off. Like we're just community site owners. Like we would never get to talk to people like you, Joel. I mean, we're usually some budget guy and never get to
Yeah.
Joel's level, right? Um, we can do a whole podcast just on your career, and maybe that's part 2. But this is the business of clinical research. And I do want to do a part 2 with just your career, like how you got in, the insights you've gained. And maybe, Chris, you want to join me on that one too, because that's right up your alley with contracts and budgets.
Yeah.
But you said something interesting, Joel. You said service providers do very well in this space, despite all the memes. Dr.
Yeah.
Fox, this one's for you, man. Despite all the memes you may see or the complaints. And I think both things can be true at the same time. So explain your thesis there, or your observations maybe.
Yeah. The nearly all segments, except for one that I'm sure we will talk about, are performing extremely well financially. And even if they're having a little bit of hiccup over the past year, whether you're talking about CROs, sites, site networks, SMOs, labs, patient recruitment companies, go on down the list, with one exception, they tend to be performing very well, and certainly better than if you spend too much time on LinkedIn. And I mean that primarily on the site side. You recently did a podcast called The Business of a CRO, and that was the first you actually made a reference to me, the dude on LinkedIn.
Yes.
And that's not the part that was interesting to me. You said, this guy showed that the best site networks have better margins than the best CROs. What was interesting to me is what you said next. You said, Chris and I know that. So I know that. You guys know that. Brad, who popped up, Brad knows it. I don't think most other people do, because they see things like you mentioned Dr. Fox showing the table. One's filled with cash, one's not. And guess which one has the cash, the CROs, and guess which one's, sitting there, looking at like a table that's been destroyed or something like that. It's a science. It's just not true. It's just not true in the vast majority of cases.
I agree with both. You're correct. And Fox is correct on the short term, the cash flow. So sites are rich accounts receivables if they're running their business right. If not, I mean, they're going to go out of business soon. There's nothing there. Sites are rich accounts receivable wise. You're right. They're cash flow poor, cash flow negative. And this is maybe why PE likes sites right now. I think it's the flavor of the month, which in our industry tends to be about 3 years.
Yeah, PE looks at potential relative to current circumstances. So they see the high EBITDA, they see the high paper earnings, they see cash flow lagging significantly, and that's their opportunity.
Yeah, so Diane says, I love this discussion. I'm budget specialist in clinical research, so it was so important to me. Okay, so so you've seen the shift. I mean, you've been in this industry long enough. You've seen the shift from, and there's a lot of shifts, and they're all like 3 years, and then they switch to something else. Like, what's the flavor of the month now, which is about 3 years? It used to be virtual trials.
Yep.
Then it was DCT. Before that, it was risk-based monitoring. So there's tools for all this stuff, right? There's like vendors pop up, startups pop up that are VC backed to go after these like little ecosystems of the flavor of the month, right?
Yep.
Which again is like 3 years. DCT bubble, I think, popped. I think most would agree. Is that the one that you said everyone's doing well with one exception? What is that exception?
That's the exception. Yep.
Yeah.
And that's a broad brush, and there's some small and growing players there that I think are legit and are raising money successfully. But there's a number. Unfortunately, none of them are publicly traded, so I can't sit here and tell you they're year over year and things like that. But there's a number that you could just tell by substantial layoffs, continuing struggles. You look at a company like Care Access with a very public blow up with Pfizer over the Lyme disease trial, things like that. But what I respect about what they're doing is that they are trying to run clinical trials faster than they run before. I'm not talking about the quality of delivery. I'm not getting into any of that. I'm not an expert of that. But when I talk to these companies about their intentions, I like their intentions, which is just as clinical research started to get digitized, 20 some years ago with EDCs and things like that, like they're trying their best to make clinical trials run more quickly. And there's a huge economic upside to that. Whoever can crack the code of sustainably making clinical trials run faster. And that's why I think some part of why there is so much money going into not just sites and site networks, but also patient recruitment companies, because the ROI on a company that can pull that off is extremely high. But for my money, the companies that do the best at patient recruitment are physical sites, and the best site networks are getting better at it. The best sites and site networks are getting better at it, from what I see, and so that's that pays off down the road.
So Dan and I have always told. So we take a lot of calls from individuals with business ideas in the industry, and we've told. I mean, I think we used to get at least one call a week on somebody with a business recruitment idea.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not as common anymore.
Because the good ones are getting. Well, shout out One in Health. They're super good.
So my first client, by the way, first client.
Okay.
Yeah.
We've told each and every one of them, hey, if you come up with an idea that works in regards to patient recruitment, easily $1 billion, if not tens of billions of dollars.
Right.
I mean, it's really the item that slows everything down, right? I mean, if you could cut timelines down by half, it's worth billions to sponsors.
But the problem is simultaneously, and
real quick, it's worth billions to investors. Yeah.
Sure.
The issue with this, though, like, and with what you said about PE, why they're excited, and I want to get to like maybe the macro reason of why they're excited in the context of what's happening in healthcare in general. There's a lot of consolidation in healthcare in general. Large systems are buying private doctors' offices, and that's happening in parallel to this consolidation here. I want to like see who's behind, who's the Wizard of Oz. There's probably 100 people that are trying to connect these things. If I'm not smart enough to go like that far down, so maybe you are, but
it's not that consolidated. It's really not. It's really not. There's so many players out there, and 100 would actually be pretty well distributed if you're talking about like organizations, whether it's PE investment firms, CROs looking to buy sites, things like that. That's a lot of potential buyers. But they're excited, they're happy by the prospects. But forget private equity for a moment. That makes me happy. Like, I want service providers in this industry to be successful. I want them to be worth a lot. The good news is that a lot of them are, and that makes me happy, because if service providers are successful financially, that tells me they're providing good service, they're running trials well. I told you before this call, I don't have a clinical bone in my body. I'm not an operations consultant. I'm not a medic. I suck at science. But I can tell when an industry is doing well and when it's not. And industry is doing well.
You checking the temperature of the industry. The industry is doing well.
except for the DCT side, and there are some exceptions there, but they had access to so much free money during the world of zero interest rates in 2020, 2021, and even as recently as a year and a half ago, that they overhired, overstructured, and they're paying for it now, and it makes me sad, but I can't blame them for doing what they did, starting their companies and raising that kind of money in those years. But they're in a tough phase right now. So I think the best ones will come out of that, through like a Darwinian process. And I think the eventual future is bright for them. Some of them will latch on, and I think CROs will buy them. The CROs will end up buying the best. Yeah.
Not so sure about that last part there.
We'll see.
We'll see.
DCT. I've never been a fan of DCT, even when first encountering their product in terms of what it actually does and what they're looking to do. They still run into that wall of patient recruitment, right?
Yes, everything boils down to that. And as it's funny, a funny thing happens as rates go higher. Investors care less about the Jetsons and they care more about the Flintstones. Like, I need something like guaranteed. Like
Yeah.
what? This is nice. Okay, you have this idea to disrupt the industry, but what about randomizing a patient, like or two? I mean, at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do, right? So, and like this stuff's happening at this like simultaneously. Studies are getting more complex. This inclusion exclusion is not getting easier. So Brad and I and Dr. Fox and Chris, we always talk about, well, we don't know the answer, and hopefully this is not the case, but clinical research seems to be at its essence like unscalable to some degree. Like there's aspects of it that are scalable, but the nitty gritty of like get this patient in, I don't know. I don't think that's necessarily scalable.
It's hard to scale, and so if you say why would a company like a CRO acquire a series of sites or site networks? Because one way to deal with that is to bring in as many of those different services and capabilities into your own organization. And so you look at an IQVIA. IQVIA is the 800-pound gorilla, but they're like vacuuming up market share. And my sense of that is because they have a superior technology strategy and execution compared to a lot of their competitors. It's not it's not random that they're buying sites. Now as a sponsor, it's more in a position where you can go to an IQVIA, you can go to a PPD with over 150 sites, you can go to an Icon with a lot more sites. And instead of going to a small CRO for a complex oncology trial where they're going to have to contract with each of the sites individually, they're going to have to contract with 10 to 15 vendors separately. We went through a lot of them earlier, labs, recruitment vendors, et cetera, and so on. You truly get to more of a one-stop shop type of situation. So that makes it at least be perceived as easier by the sponsor that, I can go to an IQVIA and I can sign one contract and they're only going out to a couple vendors, versus feeling like you're signing up with 10 to 15 different companies to run a trial. That's the benefit to the sponsor. And I do believe that there is some scale of a company like the ones that I just mentioned having sites within their own vertical chain. Doesn't mean that they'll never go to external sites. It's not about that at all. But it continues to reduce how much they have to go outside of their own ecosystem to run a trial, start to finish. That's fascinating. And Dan, the kicker for CRO is that if these sites have higher margins than you, then you're going to be willing to pay up for them because it raises your overall margin profile. Investors love that,
but
as they should.
But even on a small scale, I've never run a site bigger than 3 sites and 15 employees. I noticed even anecdotally, like when I go from one site with 2 employees to 3 with 15, my margins go down too. Like you just lose some efficiency to gain scale, right? And you also lose some quality to gain scale. Like if I'm the only coordinator,
it goes like this, Dan. So you may lose some of that early on, but then as you learn to centralize, some of those back end processes, create some shared services, then you can start to drive it back up. Some of the larger site networks that I worked with, they go through that. They add a site. Maybe year one is tough, but as they bring them into their centralized recruitment services and things like that, then that's the whole point of adding to their network over time is to get that scale.
But there's something still intrinsic about small business still being scrappier, more efficient, doing more with less. Like I've known sites that have sold and they were physician owned and they sold and the PI stopped caring so much, right? So, I mean, they can afford that because they're buying it and they can bring in someone else, but he or she's just a little bit less good than the original, right?
Yeah.
That stuff like fascinates me, but money continues to pour in. So let me ask you this, and we're gonna get into some questions. And Chris, feel free too, man. Do you think PE is inspiring IQVIA and other CROs to do this, or do you think they're just following what they're doing?
IQVIA or private equity is increasing the competitiveness and raising the overall price levels at which you have to buy these types of organizations. There's no question about it, because they're going through bidding processes, right? And so the more players in there, there you go. And these PE companies, even though interest rates are super high right now, they're still able to raise funds, and they're sitting on a lot of funds they raised when money was cheap. So they've got cash on the sidelines ready to deploy. And so you want to look for existing profitable companies where you see opportunities to increase that profitability, especially if their cash flow is lagging, their paper profitability. That's an excellent target for you. Mm-hmm. And this conversation so far has been biased towards like the large publicly traded companies, but they're very active in the small and mid-size space as well. And that's where I play, and what I find just endlessly fascinating.
So, hypothetical question, actually towards you, Dan.
Chris loves this.
So, from what you said there, Joel, if you were to acquire a site, an existing site, right, and you're looking for something that's underperforming, what items would you look at specifically to determine they're underperforming and where you could improve that?
That was to Dan, right?
Yep, that's to Dan.
First thing I would look at is, okay, are they using like tech? There is some benefit, and I know, Joel, you had some things to say about some tech vendor. We're gonna get into that too. Are they leveraging tech? Like, are they being as efficient as they could at their smaller scale? Like things like eSource, eReg. I'm a huge believer in that, and obviously I'm a CRO fan, supporter, user, loyalist. I think they're the best because they offer everything. Shout out to CRO. But there's things like Viva Site Vault, free. You want to streamline your regulatory process? You can hire someone to work from home and do all your regulatory with e-signatures, DOA. That's what I'm looking at. Then I'm looking at recruitment. Then I'm looking at biz dev. I'm looking at like those three things: operations, patient recruitment, and the biz dev. Like, can we get studies? Can we get patients? And can we not screw up our studies? And maybe can we improve the rate at which we are randomizing?
Well, I mean, two of those criteria I'd agree with, because the determining factors in top line is patient recruitment and performance, right? So are you getting studies, and are you recruiting for those studies?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if tech, again, my opinion, I don't know if tech improves top line. It may once you have some business, but if you're not seeing patients or you're not getting studies, your tech means nothing, right?
Of course, yeah.
So I don't know. I guess it's really a matter of, do you have the personnel in place, or are you getting the appropriate studies, right?
And then
I'm just trying to think of what would improve maybe these institutions that are looking to acquire sites.
I would never acquire a site.
Yeah,
we said that before. Yeah, and I know. We would never, right?
Yeah.
That's for PE. They have more money than us to lose. I would just rather start a site. You know why?
Mm-hmm.
As soon as I acquire that site, the stakeholders that made it run are gone, and now they're us. So I just bought myself more work when I could have done that for free. Mary J. Blige had a good song. She said, "I can do bad all by myself."
And on top of that, like Dan said, yeah, you lose the staff, primarily the coordinators, but what about the PI as well, right? I mean,
exactly. Now I gotta go cater to him. Hey, PI, let's go to dinner every month. Check your temperature. Where are you at? Are you okay with me as your boss? Like, oh no, like, let's get some wine. Like, what? I mean, that's all, like, come on. That's not like effortless, right? That's not passive. I don't know. I'm curious to get Joel's thoughts.
Well, first, this is where I want to give you a shout out, Dan, because I'm new to your work, and one of the things that I'm very grateful for is that you focus on helping people build careers And I think you give extremely good advice on how to approach things entrepreneurially. How to,
Thank you.
whether it's bootstrapping a business or doing it, for as little upfront capital as possible, that's absolutely doable. And there's some amazing success stories there. And then helping people build careers, like even if you're doing an hour on the business of a CRO, you tie it back to people's careers. And I just think that's amazing. So if there's anyone listening to this, as was me earlier this year, listening to Dan for the first time, we're sitting here kind of shooting the crap on CROs and private equity companies and things like that. But stick around for Dan's career advice and entrepreneurial advice. It's legit. It's legit. Yep.
I appreciate it. But yeah, like, and there's going to be people, maybe we'll get into some of these comments, but I don't think me saying I would never buy a site is going to stop PE from buying sites. Like, they're like, this guy in a hoodie and wearing a hat half the time doesn't know shit. We're smart. We're from Wharton. Like, fuck this guy. But, I think there's some truth, like on the small scale. I'd rather just go start a new site than buy one. I'd buy a distressed one. I'd consider it at least. Like, hey, I'll take over. You can't make payroll. I'll take over your payroll. Give me like, but that's more like semi-predatory at that point.
What I'd look for to point Chris's question at me is, I'm a very financially oriented guy when it comes to metrics and things like that. So I would let Dan, review their operations and tech stack and things like that. I would look at their margins just from a very traditional standpoint, but then especially for the site side, I would look at their receivables efficiency. For all the reasons we know, the way payment schedules are structured and things like that. But I would dig in deep as to how on top of the receivables they actually are. And I'm not talking about like, are you following up when you're getting paid late? Are your reconciliations in order? Are you billing everything that you should be? Are you capturing your invoiceables? What's your agings look like on your auto pays? Do you have duplicate revenue hitting? It is amazing how much duplicate revenue I have seen in working with site networks over the past year. And again, Chris, I just used the term site networks because I'm talking about companies where I see their financials across multiple sites that they own.
Don't worry, no one knows the difference.
So it's almost like, what's your internal aging on your financial processing? Do you have a clean month end every month, every quarter? Dan, I know you're a big CRO fan.
Yeah, I love it.
And my understanding is they have a great CTMS, but I see some networks really struggle when they try to use that to manage their revenue and aging. I think any tech stack is going to struggle with that. But are you managing holdbacks effectively? I would look at, are you still writing contracts with holdbacks in them? Because you shouldn't be. In fact, you should be writing contracts where you're paid for a patient up front.
Wow, and, Chris.
Yep.
Well, Chris is
guys, as long as you're performing, as long as you're a high performing site with a high reputation, yes, you can ask and achieve getting paid for one or two patients worth of upfront payments instead of a 5 or God forbid 10 or 15% holdback, which I think is unethical, but just unnecessary to agree to anymore.
Hold on. Okay, I'm gonna pass to Chris right here, but let me just preface this. Chris, the last 2 budgets we got, you did amazing, man. That's a shameless plug for our site network and our services. But look, I'm at the point I don't even look at the budgets Chris does. It's just, whatever you think is right, let's do it. So I have to put it in CRO CTMS, right? Like when I program a budget, I have to go put the numbers in. I looked at this last one. I'm like, whoa, holy crap. All screen failures paid, 0 holdback. I'm like, this is so amazing. Like, and not to mention the fees we're getting. It's something like 38% overhead. What do you think about this, Chris? Like what Joel just said, like no holdback. That's not always possible. I noticed something interesting. Sponsors are okay with that. CROs are not.
So generally speaking, sorry, go ahead, Joel.
A typical CRO contract, the CRO is paid 10 to 20% of their entire budget on signature. 10 to 20%. So if a CRO signs a new contract, say for $10 million, direct fees and pass-throughs, which most of those pass-throughs are your budgets. That contract will say, on signature, you'll pay us $1 million. That $1 million will be held until the end of the trial, and it'll be reconciled until the end. So when you're dealing with a CRO from a budget negotiation standpoint, the key thing to know is that CRO already has your funds in hand. All right. CROs are like the opposite of sites when it comes to cash flow, Dan. They have lower margins, but their cash flow is almost always well ahead of their actual profitability because they're paid in advance and they hold that money until the end of the trial, even 5-year, longer term oncology trials. So it's not always like that. Some are more sophisticated, but if you're dealing with a CRO and they're giving you crap about a holdback, if a CRO convinces a site to take a 10% holdback, that's just more money the CRO gets to hold on to, earning what's now 5.3% interest for multiple years. Not as big of a deal 3 years ago when interest rates were 0. I made the mistake of looking at my savings account where it's still earning 0.1%, but you can earn 5% on that now, and so your counterparty is already holding your money, whether it's the CRO or the biotech. So if you agree to a holdback, you're just disrespecting yourself at this point.
Wow, Chris, what do you think about
either that or you're ignorant? Seriously,
Chris, what are your thoughts, man?
If you're not ignorant, you're disrespecting yourself. Please, Chris.
That's spicy. Let's go.
So,
Chris.
I mean, there is
bad, man.
Well, there is rationale to a holdback, right?
No.
No.
What's the rationale? Convince me.
Because at the end of the trial, they still need to collect information from the sites, and if there is no holdback, they have no financial strings over the site. If everything's been paid, right, and they need work performed by the site, why does the site have to fulfill those obligations?
Work has been performed.
No. So, again, I'm not battling for the sponsors of the CROs here, but I'm telling you there is a rationale behind holdback, right? And that rationale is, let's say there's some data that they find problems with, right? And the CRO or the sponsor reaches out to the site and they've been paid for everything. The site's been paid, right? There is no holdback. They've received everything. What strings do they have to make the site perform in terms of the work they now need done? If they've been paid,
that's a closeout fee. That's a closeout fee.
Yeah, but there's oftentimes even then, it doesn't happen too often, but I've seen it happen twice at my own personal sites in which they need something performed after the closeout fee, right? But that's assuming even when that does occur, you've probably been paid on holdback at that point as well, right?
Yeah, there's no good rationale for holdbacks in this day and age. Even if there is some verification that needs to happen at the end of the trial, that doesn't mean that there needs to be payment associated with that. There are contractual remedies that they have to force that performance. But to hold back 10%,
absolutely.
10%, I could see maybe a 1% holdback. If you're going to do a holdback, do 1%. I'll give you an example in CRO world. A lot of times the CRO will be paid on a milestone payment schedule. You get 10% when the contract's signed, X% first patient in, et cetera. At the very back end of that, maybe they get paid X dollars when the CSR is written and signed off. And then maybe often the last one is the TMF is reconciled if it's assuming it's digital. There's maybe like 0.5% or 1% tied to those things. And I tell CROs, if you put 5 or 10% on that, you just agreed to a holdback. There's no reason for that. If 99% of your labor has been performed by that point, then 99% of your fees should be in your bank account.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, it's ridiculous when, and it's usually CROs, but sponsors too will have holdbacks of 10, 15, I've seen even 20%.
Mm-hmm.
And that's ridiculous. Absolutely.
It's ridiculous. You don't have to agree to it. Maybe if you just opened a site, you're trying to get business and that seems like a deal breaker, go for it. All right. And then just manage it responsibly. Don't hire up too quickly. Deal with the cash flow consequences. But if you're a high-performing site with a good brand, you do not need to agree to that. And if someone's giving you a hard time about agreeing to it, you just say, we don't accept holdbacks. That's all you have to say. And then if they ask you again, well, actually, that's really important to us. You say, we don't accept holdbacks. That's what you say. And then the third time, you just don't respond. They'll sign the damn contract, Chris. All right?
Yeah.
It's not going to be a deal breaker that I need to have this unethical hold over you on a 3 or 4 year trial in order to do business with you.
So you work
if
with
you're a strong, high-performing site.
Okay, so I'm actually legitimately curious about this question. So you work for a lot of CROs in terms of contracts, right, and budgets.
Yep.
So is it a negative reflection on a CRO if they lose a site, right? So they report to the sponsor, we have selected this site, I assume. This is what it looks like. We've selected this site. We're going to award them the trial. The sponsor approves of that in some regard, right?
Yep.
I assume this is what this looks like in terms of site selection. So the sponsor is aware of the site. The CRO starts negotiating the budget, and then for whatever reason they can't come to agreement, so they let the site go. Does that reflect poorly in terms of?
It wouldn't happen like that. Yeah, it wouldn't happen like that. So the CRO sends out the contract. The site will provide feedback. They'll disagree with some terms that the sponsor has said. The contract template needs to have these terms. And the CRO and the sponsor will agree in advance on fallback positions. So, for example, let's use holdback. The CRO will not say, "Hey, sponsor, you need to have it. We're going to put a 10% holdback in the template." They'll work on, okay, what should that be, if any, in the contract template that we're going to send out to all the sites. Let's say they say it's 5%. The CRO and sponsor will often further agree of what happens if a site says they will not accept a holdback. Then the CRO and the sponsor will pre-agree that either, okay, you need to come back to us to get that approved, or it's okay to agree to it. All right. Fallback positions, fallback parameters, there's different kind of interchangeable terms around it. But what's not going to happen is the CRO is going to send a contract out. They're going to negotiate it multiple rounds with difficult provisions. And then the sponsor finds out, oh, it didn't work out. We let them go. They're going to know along the way that, oh, the site didn't agree to these 5 things. The CRO and the sponsor will talk about it. CRO will go back, almost like a real estate agent type situation, right? They're negotiating on the sponsor's behalf. The sponsor knows what's going on. The real estate agent's not going to come back to you and say, "Hey, I didn't get your house sold," because they asked for price reduction. They're going to talk to you about it. Yeah.
Sponsors already in agreement with CRO letting go of this study or letting go of this site.
The sponsor would have to, especially in that, which would be a pretty dire situation, the sponsor would have to agree to letting that site go. The CRO is not going to say, "We let that site go." The sponsor would say, "Okay, you're fired," right? Like you can't do that. You can't do that.
So this is interesting because, and we're going to get to the comments right now, guys. Like, subscribe, comment, share. If you're listening on podcasts, now is your time to like, subscribe, comment, share. Like, do it right now, and then go follow Joel. What happens when the CRO is negotiating a contract, like you just said, with their own sites?
There are firewalls in place. Now, Dan, how strong are those? It just gets into each company. I think I put out the example in my post on Monday that I once interviewed for a company with a premier site that I think everyone listening to this would recognize, where I went down to Tennessee. I interviewed for a position at their CRO. Their CRO, I think, was on the 7th floor, took up to 7th and 8th floors. Their SMO was on the 5th and 6th floors. And this extremely well-known site was down the street. They owned it all. And actually, I linked to it because it's on their website, Sarah Cannon. You can go on their website. I put it on my LinkedIn, and you can see, like, on our services, hey, here's our site, here's our CRO, here's our SMO. They offer all that. And now I'm not speaking about them individually, but these companies do have firewalls where they're on different email servers. If they're all in the same physical office building, the CRO person can't get into the SMO floor and things like that. And part of that is part of being able to demonstrate fair market value. I don't like that term either, but to be able to demonstrate that there was an arm's length transaction in this contract negotiation. But it is, it is on the face of it problematic, and it's not. It's caused me some angst at some points, but all in all, I'm okay with it. Though, yeah, I mean, it's a little awkward.
Yeah, I mean, even maybe there's nothing wrong with it. I don't know, but you can't tell me that somebody doesn't have the key to every floor. There's people that are very influential within that organization that can make things happen when
but I
push
think
comes to shove.
an important thing to know is that a sponsor has to approve every single site that is brought onto a study. And so, the sponsor will be fully informed that, hey, 10 of your 12 sites are owned by us.
Of course.
Right? I think that's important. I used to work for a CRO, Chiltern, whose parent company owned Endpoint Clinical, one of my favorite IRT companies. Love them. And they own like 90-some% of Endpoint. And so you would think, oh, Chiltern just sent all of its, whenever a sponsor needed IRT services, Chiltern would send it all to Endpoint. No, it was a case-by-case situations, because CROs are paid to help sponsors pick the right vendors and sites for these trials. But yeah, I mean, there's always a natural motivation or incentive, right, to use your own sites if you own them. That's why you bought them.
This one, we'll come back to this. Sorry to cover your face. Ethan says, I caught the tail end. We're going to get into questions. I caught the tail end of the valuation of the 30 sites. Can you repeat the basic details of that?
Okay. What was publicly said was that by QVCO is that they paid around $300 million for CCT. And my expert analysis of their website was that they have about 30 locations, which comes out to about 10 million per site. I asked IQVIA Investor Relations to clarify some of that. They never got back to me. I'm not going to go beyond that. But Dan, actually, maybe you guys could hit the second part of that, which is what's an appropriate cash reserve at a site? Because that's a very practical question.
Yeah, Chris, maybe you handle this one. You advise sites on this all the time. What's an appropriate cash reserve?
I mean, I prefer 6 months, but I think that's up to the individual and how comfortable they are running thin margins, thin backup, whatever the case might be. I prefer 6 months. It's kind of like Dave Ramsey, right? You're supposed to have 6 months of your expenses covered in case of an emergency. I think that applies to, and I'm not a big Dave Ramsey fan, but I think that applies to businesses. I don't know, Joel.
I'm a fan. Yeah. So I think 6 months is reasonable for any business, especially a business like sites that has a significant number of employees.
And other items that they have to take into account, right? They have to pay patients and other things, and that can fluctuate. Maybe you don't have a lot of expenses in terms of patient stipends, and then all of a sudden you're enrolling tons of patients. You don't want to run low on cash.
Next question is from our boy Lee. Oh, were you going to say something, Joel?
Nope.
Lee, our boy Lee. Lee knows what's up. Do you know Lee, Joel?
No. I'm curious though.
Lee, man, go introduce yourself to Joel, man. He's a must. Okay. He's like, you guys think the same. Do you think companies like pharma or CROs being too vertically integrated will raise flags with the FDA? It really seems like we're losing a series of checks and balances that exist.
Not that I've seen. I'm not an expert on the FDA side, so I would love to read about that. I would love to see some bona fide experts weigh in on that.
Yeah, theoretically, it shouldn't be an issue, like you said. Like if there's enough firewalls in between. I've worked as a contractor, phase 1 clinics, and a lot of CROs have been owning phase 1 sites forever, like since before I got in the industry, which people didn't really realize. And then a lot of these phase 1 sites either get acquired by a CRO or become a CRO because a biotech reaches out to them first as a site and say, hey, we want to do a healthy volunteer study. And then the site probably tells them, hey, you need a CRO. Well, we can do this too. We have a separate system, all the stuff you just said, Joel. So it's not, it organically happens. It just hasn't organically happened in the phase 2 through 4, uh, because by that point, the sponsor already has a plan or like a vendor for managing. But now, money, the book Capital, written by Thomas Piketty, this is like what's playing out here. Return on cash. I mean, this is the whole point of this podcast today. So we're kind of in a new era, and not to mention the IRBs, okay, that own sites like, and I'm sure they're gonna tell you, they'll have like 10 people from Ivy Leagues telling you, well, check out this white paper we wrote on the ethical segmentation of what we do. Yeah, that's fine. But at the end of the day, the IRB's primary responsibility is patient safety and ethics. So you can't tell me there's not possibly a conflict of interest when an IRB owns sites, reviews the protocols, probably has a hand in the tech, and by the way, they're PE back too, right? So just putting it out there.
Just no comment. I mean, that's yeah, and that's yeah,
And
because I just don't have strong feelings on that side of it. I just don't.
I mean, I'm coming around to it because these companies are. I used to be like vehemently opposed to it, like just from a purist, and probably because I'm a little salty. Like these are the big guys, we're small.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that. I'm starting to see the other side, like you said, if they're getting big enough to where they can actually justify, like, hey, these are separate business units altogether. I can come around to it, at least in theory, but where the rubber meets the road, there's connections. Like these things are integrated. They're not actually separate companies.
Yeah, and Dan, if this really takes off, it's something that I'm going to have to think a lot more through the ethical side of it. For what it's worth, and in the real life situations I've experienced on this, I have not seen inappropriate behavior. Doesn't mean it's never happened, but
Right.
if it really takes off, if it becomes a thing where it's commonplace for CROs to own sites, then I have a feeling even the FDA may weigh in on that, or at least review it.
Maybe. We got a lot of questions here. Let's get it. Kelvin might cover not just your face, Joel, but all of ours. It's a tsunami comment. Oh, no, only yours. Decentralized clinical trials, the fresh new wave of the electronic future, or so they say. I like this guy. He's put a wave in his thing. That's synchronicity. It's as if remote monitoring, electronic capture, and other not so new tools haven't been part of clinical trials for ages. But let's all pretend this is groundbreaking, even though it's more like putting a new label on an old bottle. After all, who doesn't love emphasizing a trend as if it's fundamentally a new approach? I mean, yeah, I agree, Kelvin. I think it's getting more powerful though. Like there's elements of DCT, like e-consent, amazing, right? Amazing. That's an element of DCT I have no problem with. What Creo's doing, right? eSource.
Yep.
They give the sponsor the back end, hey, if you use enough sites with Creo, you get the EDC. We'll just throw it in there and you get data management. We're working on a small CRO project with Creo. There's no need for an EDC vendor. As long as the sites use Creo, that's the EDC.
Yeah. Nice.
So, I mean, there's benefits to this too, like DCT, and is that considered DCT? Who knows anymore? Like DCT is gonna be a bad word now, like SMOs were, but now I guess SMOs are coming back in favor.
I'll tell you, Dan. I mean, I have worked with several DCT companies, but in terms of like what takes up my mind and absorbs a lot of my analysis, it's not those companies. Not because I don't like them. It's because even though they grab a high percentage of the attention and conversation on social media, they're still an extraordinarily tiny player in the economics of clinical research. And so I continue to focus the majority of my time and attention on the companies that do drive the vast majority of economics. That's sites, that's CROs, and then that's the ecosystem of vendors around them, because that is still what's driving it. And I can't remember if I'm repeating myself or it was before we started, but someday the best will arise from the DCT crowd, through a Darwinian process. And I think that there will be important contributions to make. But I will correct something I said earlier that, Chris, you challenged me on. I think you're absolutely right. I said, yeah, CROs will buy them. And that was a flippant comment that was will very likely be proven to be wrong. Because as soon as I said it, I was like, well, IQVIA has been building out those functionalities, as has several of the other bigs. What's interesting is that the small and mid-size are still trying to partner up with the DCT. The small and mid-size CROs are still largely partnering up with the DCTs, and that's proving to not be a successful strategy.
Proving not to be. Interesting.
Proving not to be, yeah.
And why?
Because a lot of the trials end up just going to physical sites. So you waste a lot of time and effort on a partner that, even if it had worked out, you're partnering out all that revenue. You're partnering whatever profitability is there. And again, a sponsor prefers to work with companies that have as much of the services in-house as possible, instead of feeling like, okay, wow, we just effectively signed up with multiple CROs.
Multiple service agreements and all that stuff too. Interesting. Yeah, we're in the middle of a CRO bid, so we're playing a little bit, like we're getting a small taste. I mean, we have no intention of competing with IQVIA, but there's a lot of opportunities on the extremely small end of the long tail of small sponsors that, I mean, IQVIA wouldn't even give them their D team, right? And still charge like 10 times what a niche CRO would charge. And there's something interesting about strategic partnerships with CROs and functional tech vendors, like CRO using EDC as an example, right? Or maybe a TMF being integrated somehow. So I think even the term DCT, it's become like so ugly and so like convoluted. No one really knows what that actually means anymore.
Yeah, that's why I don't pay a lot of attention to the terminology around it. I focus on what's really driving the industry forward. Again, from an economics standpoint. But for especially for your listeners, one thing I don't want them to leave a lot of the social media conversation around sites and CROs thinking is that it's impossible to start up a site at low cost and that you're going to be broke for the first couple of years. That's where I encourage them to listen to some of your other shows. And then, but I do want to temper people on the CRO side. There was a comment made on on the previous shows, not by you guys, was that CROs with 500 people have $1 billion in revenue, and that's just to say that that's false is like, I mean, that is just like so that CROs need 500 people to have $1 billion of revenue. That a bunch of CROs have billions of revenue, that they have 200% margins on CRAs, all this stuff. It's not just true. It is very difficult to start up a CRO. But if you do it successfully, you don't need to win a lot of studies. You win a $3 million study as a CRO, where say it's just you and your spouse owning the CRO with a series of contractors. You'll never go back to work for a company again.
Oh, never.
It's life-changing. It's life-changing.
Yeah. Especially if you're
it's hard
to
win those first couple ones. It's very hard to win those first couple ones, but it's life-changing when you do. And you don't need to have 500 people. You don't need to have anything like that.
And maybe that's like there's two extremes of what's happening is consolidation on one end and then lifestyle businesses on the other.
Yeah. Consolidation is always opportunity. It's always opportunity on the small scale side. It's always there because plenty of companies don't want to work with consolidated companies. They always gravitate towards smaller service providers. And so that's the opportunity. The more consolidation there is, the better it is for folks like us on this call, running small organizations like yours, sitting here as an independent consultant who sometimes has to go up against large, well-known consulting companies. That's the opportunity. I don't care what the big consulting companies do. I don't care if they merge up. If they do, that's just more opportunity for me. If more sites get bought by CROs, if more sites come together, that's more opportunities for people to start their own sites.
Well, another interesting thing happens from a career perspective when consolidation occurs. You have all these lifelong employees. I've interviewed dozens of them in the last year that I off the top of my head. I've been with CRO XYZ for 15 years. Once the merger happened, that was my catalyst to go out on my own.
Yep.
Like that happens over and over again. So not just the consolidation is creates the opportunity, but it also creates a career demand because the best employees tend to leave.
Yeah, that part is brutal. But I mean, that's a big reason why I'm out on my own. I told you,
Yes.
three of the 4 CROs I worked at no longer exist. PRH, Altern, and Centeract. And I was like, well, I feel like a free agent, so I might as well go be one. And so after Syneos closed on Syneos, I flipped that around. After Syneos closed on Centeract, I moved on and went out on my own in June 2021.
Were you like shown to the door, or did you just say, you know what, screw this? Like, I don't like this.
No, I just, over my career, Dan, I gravitated from the large CROs. I mean, I was at PRA when it was 1,500 people. When it got bought by Icon, it was almost 20,000. Icon is 41,000 people. So I said I didn't want to work for the big CROs. Nothing personal against people who are there. But every time I went to a mid-sized CRO, Chiltern got bought out by a big. Went to Syneos, got bought out by a big. I'm like, well, this will probably keep happening. Yeah, now I don't have to worry about getting bought out by a big CRO, basically. But now I still love working with those companies. Yeah.
But now the same thing's happening. History rhymes on the site side, at least the big site side for now, and maybe even the small. I know I have colleagues that are getting offers. I mean, we got offers. We're a startup. We weren't worth anything when we're getting these offers. I told them, chill, come back in like 3 years and we can talk. Let me build something. There's nothing right now. But they're thirsty, man. They're thirsty.
I just want people to be optimistic about the industry and the entrepreneurial opportunities there. Yeah.
It's there, and if you're an employee and you need to start thinking about these things too, like, oh, my company's going to take care of me. Well, what happens when they consolidate? Like, your company is not your company anymore, and you got to have a skill set. You got to figure out. Yeah, and it's not just, I mean, and then the lifestyle business on the low end of the long tail, like CRA makes what, like 90 to 120K, maybe 150. Traveling on the plane 3 days a week, 12 visits a month, maybe, missing out on family life, and not to mention the circadian rhythms. I mean, that's a lot.
Dan, my wife did 4 cost site audits when she was in the industry. And so, yeah, she traveled. She was in the QA department of a CRO, and the stuff she saw. We could do a thing on that. I don't think she'd be too happy about that, but man, she saw some stuff. But yeah, the travel. She traveled like a CRA. It was intense.
So you lived it, like
lived it.
90, 150K, and then you start thinking, okay, well, if I can start putting pieces together, maybe I could be like a boutique arm or a boutique vendor, maybe not a full CRO, but a boutique vendor of a pharma or a CRO. Like Carla Veranava, she started out as a receptionist at a site. She specialized in phase 1. You got to meet her, Joel. Receptionist at a site, immigrant from Nicaragua. Receptionist at a phase 1 clinic, became a recruiter, became a coordinator, became a QA. They got merged into a CRO. Then she learned monitoring. No bachelor's. Now she runs a consulting firm helping just on phase 1 QA and rescue audits. Like, making bank quintupled. I don't know her numbers. She makes bank. She's not making CRA money. Let's put it that way.
You know what, man? Good for her. I love that stuff.
And how many of those stories are out there that we don't know about? I mean, there's a lot. So this industry
you found
offers
me.
a lot.
Yeah, you found me.
There you go, man. Yeah. I mean, geez, the gig economy is real, and it's a side effect of the consolidation, I think.
Great stuff.
We got more. Do you have a little more time? Like, we got more questions, or you got to
A
go?
little more time. Yep.
This is great, Joel. We got to do part 2 and 3. And I know who you're referring to now from that CRO business side, Robert. I got to get you and Robert on. We can do a debate. I'll just be in between. I don't know the CRO world. And Chris can be on too. You could be there for like emotional support or something. Or like you'll probably like add more than I will. We got to do part 2. Part 2, I still want to do your career though, and then part 3 maybe with Robert. You guys will actually find a lot of common ground, I think.
Yeah.
Kelvin, what strategies or tools have proven effective in ensuring that the budget and coverage analysis are accurate, compliant, and aligned with the overall objectives of the trial? Chris, Joel, what do you think?
Chris?
Sorry, give me a moment.
Chris is reading emails,
I can go.
Yeah. You got budgets or something? Chris is cranking out like 80 contracts a month. 80 contracts, budgets a month. Dude is an animal. What strategy? This is up your alley, man. Kelvin, what strategies or tools have proven effective in ensuring that the budget and coverage analysis are accurate, compliant, and aligned with the overall objectives of the clinical trial?
Consultants.
Oh, thanks. Is that a shout out to me?
Indirectly, probably.
Well, what tools? I mean, what tools are there? There's nothing to help you in that regard.
Yeah, if we're talking the site side, yeah, you're price takers, right? In terms of you receive the proposed budget. Now you hopefully like have your own standards. So okay, try to get into some of Kelvin's questions here. When you need to have standards around like the minimum that you would accept for certain services, and even if that can vary by therapeutic area or type of trial, et cetera, you need to have some standards. How do you set those standards? One is benchmark. So I find that the site community is pretty tight. A lot of people know each other. There's no reason why you can't know what 5 of your closest friends charge, for an ICF, right? Or different types of procedures, or liver biopsy or whatever, right? There's no reason that you all can't talk about it. And if you don't have many friends, there are resources like Grant Plan and Grant Manager and such, which provide external benchmarks. And then, like Chris, you've mentioned, there are external people who can do that work for you and provide you those benchmarks. So you have the external benchmarks, and then 2, you have your internal benchmarks. You don't have to do this for all your services, but how long does it take you to perform some of those procedures? By which people? And sorry to sound like impersonal about it, how much do those people cost? And then, what's the sum total of that labor effort relative to the price that you're getting? I.e., are you making enough of an internal margin on those tasks to make it worthwhile? If your internal effort is out of whack with the external benchmark, that means that you have an inefficient process. But you want to look at both, because if you don't look at the benchmark, you only look at your internal cost, and you're super efficient at what you do, you're going to undercharge. You're going to leave a lot of money on the table. But if you only look at benchmarking without regards to your internal cost structure, you could be performing a lot of services and losing money on them. But worst of all, just not knowing. So different ways of making sure that your budget, I don't know about the compliance and that piece of what he asked about, but how to make sure it's accurate and profitable is to know whether the price that you're agreeing to or sending out at least meets your internal standards and that you're not leaving money on the table. Go ahead, please.
So to expand on what Joel said there, unfortunately in this industry, there is no standard for the most part, right? So really the way that it works, some sponsors, it's funny because I was just texting somebody else about this that's watching this. The way it works in this industry, some sponsors will pretty much give you everything you ask for, right? But you can't base your future budgets on those parameters because they won't be correct. You're not going to get it with other sponsors. So you have to make a decision. Is this study worthwhile? And this is what Joel, I think, is getting at. You have to make decisions on whether or not it's worthwhile for you to do a study if the sponsors are not going to meet your requests. And this happens. I mean, we have one person that we've worked with, Dan and I, and she has her bare minimums, and it's on each and every line item. And if they won't meet those minimums, she's not taking the trial, period. And I've seen her refuse to take trials. Like, listen, we can't agree. Here's my minimums. If you're not going to meet those, we're done. And sponsors walk away. So there's like I said, unfortunately, you can't just do one or two budgets and understand the industry in terms of what you're going to get for a trial, because there are no standards. Once you have some experience, then you kind of have a better idea of what is reasonable, what isn't. There's really just, in my experience, I just call it kind of a fair realm, right? Yeah. Here's the low side of fair. Here's the high side of fair.
It's your intuition, Chris. It's what I call price discovery. It's through the course of many years negotiating these things. Your subconscious is discovering the right price ranges.
Yep.
And I'll get CROs who ask me CROs will ask me what's the prevailing market rate for CRA? It's a range. It's not an exact number. Not everybody's sitting there charging $220 an hour for CRA. It's a range.
Yep.
You have to accept the variability. Yeah.
Yep. There are no standards, unfortunately. It'd make the industry much more simple if it were for all things, right? Hourly rates for employees. What's this line item we're paying to sites from a CRO or sponsor level? But there just isn't. I mean, there absolutely is not.
Yeah. I mean, there are standardized methodologies for doing the cost rates of your employees and things like that. And there are standard approaches.
But even those things vary from sponsor to sponsor, right? Or from CRO to CRO.
Organization to organization.
Yep.
And you also don't have to do a time and motion study. You don't need to sit there with a camera like the original management consultant Frederick Taylor did, where he would do he didn't have a camera, but he would sit there and watch people sew and say, okay, that took that person 5.2 minutes. You don't need to get down into the weeds of time and motion studies, but you should know how long it takes a coordinator to sit with someone during a certain procedure, and which makes them unavailable for other types of work, and what the economic cost of that is. And you don't have to do that for all of your services, but the ones that drive your economics, I certainly advocate it.
Another thing, observation is the decentralization of knowledge. It's like Chris's answer is complete when he said a consultant. That's how you know, because there's people like Chris, like Joel, like Dr. Fox, who does a really good job for sites. There's probably others that we don't know. For sure, there's others we don't know that do this and offer these services, and kind of levels the playing field, I think. But this is why networking is so important if you're out there watching it. By the way, I gotta say, if retention in studies is used as a metric, retention of viewers on this video has been through the roof, Joel.
Really? Okay.
We have not dropped off for a Friday. This is performing asymmetrically. PE would want to buy this live stream. 10x.
I know a guy.
They'll buy this live stream. We'll make it NFT and sell it, man.
I think if I can just mention one thing on Chris, we were talking about. He's saying he knows, he knows what pricing to charge. I think a benefit of external objective advice on that is intuition can get stuck at a point in time. And so I wrote the other day, is someone can sit there, I'll use a CRO example, and say, building an EDC should cost $100K. I've seen examples where you dig in with that person, that information can be 5 or 10 years old.
Yes.
Because you just have this nice round number. And if the people doing that work are paid a lot more than they used to be, if the builds are more complex, or on the reverse side, they're simpler, intuition can get outdated if you're in your bubble. There's nothing wrong with being in your bubble, but it could be time to talk to someone who's not in a bubble. But that's why I just encourage people, especially through periods of high inflation, expectations around what things should cost get outdated very, very quickly.
120% accurate. Absolutely correct. So even in what I do, for a short while, I probably was asking too little in terms of budget requests. Thankfully, I received a couple of budgets that were quite higher initially from the sponsors than I was used to.
Yeah.
I realized very quickly, I haven't been asking for enough.
That's when you knew.
So thankfully, for our Dan and our clients, they didn't suffer too much, but a few did, honestly, just because as you described, I was stuck in my zone. Right, this is how it's been. This is how it continues to be. So hopefully, anybody who does this is aware of that factor, that things do change, and be aware of that.
Yeah, be willing to learn, but don't beat yourself up if you underprice the first few things. I'm a pricing consultant. I underpriced my first several projects when I went out on my own. It happens. I probably did beat myself up over it, but you got to be willing to learn and discover the appropriate prices and then adjust them over time.
And is it a factor of like not being insular? Like, is this a good plug for SaveOurSites.com or
you go for it? Yeah.
Networking? Like Derm, I remember, Chris, we had a Derm study. At the time, you weren't that experienced with Derm, maybe, and you were like, "Nah, from my experience, Derm are like low budget." Then you saw one of our budget, you're like, "Wow, this one's actually pretty high." So it kind of changed your opinion on Derm as the Derm started seeing a bull market, right? So it was like you caught it at the early end, so you can like help clients negotiate better. So it's like you have to be active. You can't just be theoretical, and sit back.
Yeah,
and that's,
but folks listening to this, if you've got entrepreneurial ambitions, it's a big hurdle, to find those first few pieces of work for studies if you're a site, so on and so forth. And they might not; those first ones may not turn out that great, but if you're a competent person, just be willing to trust yourself that you're going to learn what you need to learn over time and then get really good at what you do.
Ethan, this one's to strike my ego, maybe. Thank you, Ethan. What Dan is describing is completely true in traditional healthcare. Healthcare networks acquire private practices and turn everyone, including the doctors' owners, into employees. There is less passion after that. However, the new crop of docs owners are far less entrepreneurial, and the younger gen like punching a clock and saying peace out at the end of the day. Yeah,
well,
but
that's
don't
a
tell
plug
the
for you,
PE
Dan,
this.
because that's what you're trying to help motivate people to do, to be entrepreneurial. And if you're not entrepreneurial, no big deal. There's nothing wrong with that. But like nothing is worse than someone having that ambition and just feeling like it's an impossible thing to do.
Right, but to your point,
that's why I appreciate you.
Thank you. But to your point and to Ethan's point, like this is just free market. Like if that system, that new system, does not produce over time, that's not a system that's repeatable by others. So the cycle just continues. And to your point, Joel, I'm glad this is happening for service providers because they have an exit if they want. They don't have to. No one's forcing them to sell, gun to your head.
Yeah.
Our PI, who's close to retirement age, he's been offered dozens of times to sell his private practice. Nope.
Yeah.
From a purely ethical person, he does not want to sell to the large hospital system in town. So no, he'd rather just shut it down at the end of the day than sell it. So, but the option is there. Exit. Us entrepreneurs take a lot of risk. It's nice to know at the end of the tunnel, there's the option to exit. The greater fool theory exists. Like, hey, we know this is overvalued, but we're going to buy this. We're going to flip it because someone else is going to be a greater fool than us. And then the last one holding it ends up being the greater fool. They all know the game they're playing. They just don't know when the music stops.
Yep. The bag holder.
All right. One more. LinkedIn user. Identify yourself, LinkedIn user. Papers, please. From my experience in the UK, cost varies so much from site to site. Typically, sponsors understand this, and there's always room to move on specific budget elements. It is always worth asking what the tolerance is on each budget line. You might miss out on some lines and make it on others as long as the aggregate looks okay. Great discussion, chaps. Great discussion, chaps.
Yeah.
Do you go line by line? Chris, you go line by line?
Yeah.
Man, I just look at the bottom line. When Chris sends it to me, I'm like, oh, yeah, this is good. I'm done.
Then that's good. That makes me even more happier that Chris goes line by line. I'd be concerned if neither of you were.
back in the day, I used to just be like, let's go. Like they would send me something, I would just increase everything by like 50% and then add a 20% overhead and call it a day.
Yep.
But Chris is much more sophisticated. So thank you, chaps. All right, guys. Anything else? Everybody go follow Joel right now. I would tell you to do the same for Chris, but he's unfindable. So don't try. Just message me or Chris at theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Haven't shouted out your email in a long time, Chris.
Thanks, Dan.
And then
Dan,
Joel,
thanks for having me on. Like I said, I'm new to your work,
great.
and I'm going to be watching your stuff for a long time. Thank you for what you do, and thanks for having me.
Well, likewise, man. I mean, we need people like you, and I've been looking for this, and everything I've found is like kind of paid for by pharma. And you're independent, man. You're not afraid to call people out on LinkedIn. You're a must follow. So everybody go follow Joel right now, connect with him, follow all his stuff. You're going to learn a lot more and you'll be entertained too. At the same time, learn and entertain.
Yes,
and his comment section is popping, guys. Like people throwing shade at each other. No, this and that. Yeah, get in there. Get in there, guys. All right. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Chris. It was a great one. We'll do a part 2 and a part 3. Like, subscribe, comment, share. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.